The bells of St. Paul's tolled through the morning drizzle, their sombre peal rolling between battered stone and soot-streaked glass, settling into the bones of a city still shuddering from last night's raid. Eleanor Whitaker stood very still before the war memorial, her breath clouding in the chill, her gloved finger lingering over the newly carved letters, Lt. Tomasz Zielinski. Her name was nowhere on this monument, yet it felt as if her heart had been engraved there too, chiseled into the cold granite alongside his. Would you believe me if I told you that sometimes, in the midst of war, hope refuses to die, even when names are written in stone? A gust of wind flapped the hem of her navy coat, drawing her attention to the crowd gathered in silence, faces bowed beneath umbrellas like a field of mourning lilies. The city's wounds were everywhere, shattered windows patched with cardboard, fire-blackened brick, the metallic tang of wet ash, but nothing so raw as the wound beneath Eleanor's ribs. Her gaze traced Tomasz's name again, the sharpness of the Z, the sweep of the L. She thought about the last letter she'd sent, words of comfort, hope, and longing folded into thin blue airmail, a prayer carried by uncertain hands. She'd written it weeks ago before the telegram, before the news that his Spitfire had vanished over the channel, before the silence that had settled like dust across her life. A hand, gloved and unfamiliar, tapped her shoulder. Eleanor turned, startled, to find a middle-aged man with deep-set eyes and a threadbare scarf, rainwater beading on his brow. He leaned close, his voice a whisper, meant only for her. He's alive. The world seemed to stop. The bells faded. The drizzle became an afterthought. Eleanor stared, heart thundering, but before she could speak, before she could even process the words, the story rewound itself, yanking her back through memory and longing to the moment she first arrived in London, a stranger in a city at war. The first time Eleanor stepped onto the platform at Paddington Station, the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp wool. The war had pressed itself into every crevice of London, sandbags stacked along walls, blackout curtains drawn tight, the anxious scurry of feet between newsboys hawking the latest headlines. She'd come with a battered suitcase, a press badge tucked into her coat pocket, and an assignment to cover the spirit of the British home front for the Herald Tribune. She was 32, sharp-eyed and quick to smile, her American accent softened by the lilt of her British-born parents. New York was far behind her now. In its place, a city both familiar and utterly transformed by conflict. The station echoed with the sound of arrivals and departures, mothers clutching children, soldiers in olive drab and blue uniforms sharing cigarettes and hurried kisses. Outside, London wore its scars with a kind of battered pride. The rows of terraced houses, windows cross-hatched with tape against flying glass, leaned together as if seeking comfort. Shopkeepers swept up rubble and carried on, and the pubs glowed with the promise of warmth and company beyond the blackout curtains. Eleanor's first nights were spent in a cramped room above Mrs. Greeley's boarding house on Ebury Street, the wallpaper peeling and the mattress prickly with old springs. The air raid sirens howled most evenings, sending the residents, an assortment of typists, nurses and a retired opera singer, scurrying to the cellar with thermoses of tea and well-worn playing cards. There, in the flickering candlelight, Eleanor learned the subtle art of wartime conversation, how to speak of husbands gone to the front in the past tense, how to laugh softly when the walls trembled, how to let silence hold what words could not. By day, she navigated the city's battered arteries, notebook in hand, seeking stories in soup kitchens and queues for rationed bread. She walked beneath barrage balloons and the silver flash of searchlights, past posters urging, "Keep calm and carry on," past the ever-present reminders that life and death were separated by the thinnest of veils. But loneliness was a constant companion, curling around her ankles like London fog. Letters from home arrived sporadically, stained with rain and the censor's black ink. She wrote back in careful script, omitting the worst of the bombings, the nights spent sleepless beneath the drone of Luftwaffe engines. It was in that strange, uncertain spring of 1943 that Eleanor received an invitation, typed on thick cream paper, its edges smudged with ink, to attend a reception honoring Allied pilots at the Savoy Hotel. The assignment was simple enough. Gather material for a feature on the International Brotherhood of Flyers, the unsung heroes of the air. She dressed with care, pinning her hair in a tidy roll, buttoning her best navy suit, and tucking her press badge discreetly at her waist. The Savoy's ballroom shimmered with candlelight, the crystal chandeliers throwing fractured rainbows across uniforms of every color: RAF blue, Canadian khaki, the crisp olive of American airmen, the deep green of exiled Poles. The air buzzed with voices, laughter, the clink of glasses, and beneath it all the undercurrent of unshed fear. Every man in the room was a survivor, if only for tonight. Eleanor moved through the crowd, interviewing pilots in halting French, clipped Polish, and drawling Midwestern English. She jotted notes on the backs of napkins, careful to capture the cadence of their stories, the hope, the bravado, the longing for home. That was when she saw him standing near the far window, half in shadow. He was tall, lean in the way of men who'd spent too much time in the air, his dark hair cut close, his uniform immaculate but threadbare at the cuffs. His eyes, a piercing grey-blue, scanned the room with the quiet alertness of someone who'd learned to expect the unexpected. Eleanor approached, notebook in hand, heart quickening for reasons she could not name. Lieutenant Tomasz Zielinski, RAF Volunteer Reserve. He introduced himself in flawless, lightly accented English. He offered a small, polite smile, but his gaze held a gravity that made her catch her breath. Eleanor Whitaker, Tribune, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. May I ask you a few questions for my article? He nodded, hands clasped behind his back. Of course, though I'm afraid my English grows rusty at times. She smiled, sensing his modesty was a shield. I think your English is better than most Londoners, Lieutenant. A faint colour rose in his cheeks. You are kind, Miss Whitaker. They spoke for only a few minutes. She asked about the challenges of flying night patrols, the camaraderie among exiled pilots, the difficulties of writing home. He answered with careful restraint, skirting the edges of personal pain. When she pressed gently about his family, his mouth tightened and he glanced away. I have none here, he said simply. Poland is far now. She felt the ache in his words, the vastness of all he'd lost. Before she could offer comfort, a senior officer called Tomasz away, and he excused himself with a formal nod. Eleanor watched him go, her pen poised above her notebook, heart unsettled. She'd interviewed hundreds of soldiers, but something about Lieutenant Zielinski lingered. A quiet sadness, a dignity that drew her in. She spent the next week chasing deadlines and rationing her meager supply of tea. The city moved on beneath a drizzle that never quite became rain, the sky an endless sheet of grey. Each day brought new headlines: bombings in Bristol, advances in North Africa, the stubborn resilience of Londoners standing in the rubble. Still, she found her thoughts returning to the pilot with the poet's eyes. Their next encounter came by chance, in the smoky warmth of the Red Lion, a neighborhood pub favored by Polish expatriates and war correspondents. Rain drummed against the windows, and the air was thick with pipe smoke and the low hum of conversation. Eleanor, drawn by the promise of a hot meal and perhaps a story, slipped inside and found Tomasz at a corner table, a battered notebook open before him, pencil in hand. He looked up, surprised but pleased. Miss Whitaker, he greeted her, the formality softened by a genuine smile. Lieutenant, she replied, setting her satchel on the chair beside her. May I join you? Please, he said, closing his notebook with a practiced flick. Though I fear I am poor company tonight. She tilted her head, studying him. You write poetry, don't you? He hesitated, then nodded. Only in Polish. It is difficult to make beauty in another tongue. Would you read me one someday? She asked, surprising herself. A long pause, then quietly. Perhaps, if there is ever time. They spoke then of simpler things, of the city, of rationing, of childhood memories. Tomasz described his family's farm outside Krakow, the apple trees blooming in spring, his mother's laughter. Eleanor spoke of New York's skyscrapers, the taste of bagels on Sunday mornings, the way the city never truly slept. Between them, a tentative connection grew, fragile as the paper lanterns that glowed above the bar. Eleanor felt the old walls of journalistic objectivity waver, the line between observer and participant blurring. But Tomasz remained guarded, his smiles rare and fleeting. He spoke little of his missions, only that the sky is never the same twice. and that each flight was a prayer for safe return. Sometimes Eleanor caught him staring at the fire, lost in thought, the pencil in his hand motionless. Days passed, and then weeks. London's spring crept in, shy and uncertain, daffodils blooming in ragged patches beside bomb craters. Eleanor's days were filled with work, interviewing mothers in soup kitchens, writing features on victory gardens, editing stories late into the night in the crowded press office off Fleet Street. Yet always, she found herself watching for Tomasz, at the airfield in Oxfordshire where she sometimes visited for stories, at the Red Lion where the smell of strong coffee and the sound of unfamiliar laughter reminded her of how much everyone had lost. She began to learn the rhythms of war, the shriek of sirens, the hurried descent into shelters, the waiting and the not knowing. She learned, too, the peculiar ache of caring for someone whose world could vanish in the space between one letter and the next. Tomasz, for his part, seemed to wrestle with his own ghosts. He spoke little of his missions, but once, late at night in the shelter, his voice low and tired, he said, "Every time I fly, I think of home. And every time I land, I think of who did not." Eleanor reached for his hand, and he let her hold it, just for a moment. The world above might have been ending, but in that instant she felt something fiercely alive, a hope that defied the darkness. The war pressed on, relentless. Letters were lost in transit, news arrived days late, and every reunion was shadowed by the possibility of loss. Yet the bond between Eleanor and Tomasz deepened, through half-finished cups of tea, hurried conversations in the rain, glances exchanged across crowded rooms. Still, the obstacles loomed. Eleanor's editors pressed her for stories. "Give us the human angle, Whitaker, but don't get too close," while Tomasz withdrew further, haunted by duty and memory. He spoke of wanting to return to Poland, to fight for a country that barely existed on any current map. Sometimes Eleanor glimpsed a flicker of guilt in his eyes, as if every moment of happiness was a betrayal of those left behind. She tried to remain objective, to keep a reporter's distance. But the truth was, she was falling in love with a man who might vanish at any moment, swallowed by the machinery of war. One afternoon, as the city emerged from yet another sleepless night, Eleanor visited the small library on St. John's Square, seeking a quiet place to write. The librarian, Miss Agnes Cartwright, greeted her with a gentle smile, offering a cup of weak tea and a seat by the window. The room was lined with books rescued from bombed-out houses, their spines battered but proud. Ms. Cartwright, with her silver hair and eyes like faded violets, seemed to sense Eleanor's restlessness. "We all carry burdens, my dear," she said, arranging a stack of poetry anthologies. "Some we carry for ourselves, and some for others." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. "Have you ever loved someone at war?" Miss Cartwright asked, her voice so soft it might have been a memory. Eleanor hesitated, then offered a trembling smile. "I think I might." The older woman patted her hand. "Then you are very brave." That night, as Eleanor walked home beneath the blackout sky, she thought of Tomasz, of the way his hand had felt in hers, of the secrets he kept, of the possibility that love, even in wartime, could be a kind of defiance. The days blurred into one another, raids, headlines, brief interludes of peace. Eleanor learned to live in the spaces between. She poured her heart into her articles, chronicling not just the destruction, but the resilience of ordinary people. The shopkeeper who rebuilt his store after each bombing, the nurse who sang lullabies in the shelter, the pilot who wrote poetry in the margins of his flight logs. And always at the edges of her life Tomasz remained, a presence both comforting and distant, a promise that could not be kept. Until one morning the telegram arrived. Typed in cold impersonal language, it informed her that Lieutenant Tomasz Zielinski was missing in action, presumed dead. The world tilted, and Eleanor's carefully constructed composure shattered. She wandered the city. The world seemed to tilt the moment the stranger's breath grazed Eleanor's ear, the words "he's alive" sinking into her skin like the cold drizzle. But before she could turn, before she could even process hope or outrage or disbelief, time itself recoiled, reeling back through the thickening fog of memory to the days when the city's wounds were still fresh and Tomasz's name was not yet carved in stone. London, autumn of 1943. The city bled blue-black shadows under the pall of rationed light. Eleanor Whitaker learned to walk the streets by feel rather than sight, her hands steady on her notepad, her mind reeling with stories that pressed against the blackout curtains of every window. She'd arrived with the intention of recording history, but the city, its fractured stoicism, its urgent pulse, had quickly rewritten her. Nights were punctuated by sirens and the dull, trembling roar of distant bombs, mornings by the sour tang of smoke and the clatter of heels on wet cobblestones. In the press office, Eleanor's American vowels stood out like a trumpet blast. She was welcomed and warily regarded in equal measure, her colleagues uncertain if she was an ally or a competitor. Her reports, dispatched by cable and battered across the Atlantic, were praised for their clarity and detail. Still, the stories she filed felt incomplete, as if she were always just outside the heart of things, observing through glass she could never quite break. It was during these first weeks, before the war memorial, before the name, when she encountered Tomasz Zielinski again. Their first meeting had been a brush of hands at the Allied pilots' press event, a moment so brief it might have been imagined. But now, in the battered warmth of the Rose and Crown pub, he stood in the corner beneath an oil lamp, the collar of his uniform jacket damp with rain, the shadow of a bruise darkening his cheekbone. Eleanor found herself drawn to him, not just for the angle of his jaw or the quiet steadiness in his gaze, but for the way he seemed to occupy the space between presence and absence, like a word half-spoken. They sat across from each other at a scarred wooden table. Around them, pilots and correspondents mingled, laughter jostling with fear, the air thick with the scent of spilled ale and damp wool. Tomasz's English was precise, shaped by Polish vowels and the discipline of a man who'd learned to listen before he spoke. "Do you always write about strangers?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. "Only the interesting ones," Eleanor replied, smiling over the rim of her teacup. "And you, Lieutenant, do you always talk to journalists?" He shrugged, the ghost of a smile flickering across his lips. "Sometimes, when the night is long, when the world feels impossible." She would learn in time that he had lost both parents to the first German bombs that fell on Warsaw, that he'd escaped Poland with nothing but a battered suitcase and a notebook filled with poems he would not let anyone read, that he joined the RAF as much out of fury as out of hope, flying missions that he described only in the vaguest of terms. She learned these things in increments, as if Tomasz doled out his history in rationed portions, careful never to offer more than he could bear to reclaim. They became conspirators in stolen hours. In the mornings, Eleanor slipped Tomasz cryptic notes folded between the pages of books borrowed from Ms. Cartwright's library. After dark, when the city's wounds reopened and the sirens wailed, they walked together under the shelter of bombed-out arcades, their hands sometimes brushing, sometimes not. Eleanor found herself memorizing the cadence of Tomasz's voice, the way he weighed each word. She was drawn to the sorrow threaded through his laughter, to the gentleness that lingered in his rare, genuine smiles. One night, huddled in the narrow confines of a public shelter as the ground trembled and dust sifted from the ceiling, Tomasz pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket. He handed it to Eleanor without a word. The poem was written in careful English, the lines spare and aching. She read it twice before looking up. "You could publish this," she whispered, voice barely audible above the muted thud of falling bombs. He shook his head. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some words are only for the dark." The war pressed in on every side. Eleanor's work became a lifeline, a way to make sense of the chaos, to impose order on a world unraveling at its seams. She reported on ration lines and fire wardens, on the stubborn courage of Londoners who patched their lives together with tea and stubborn jokes. But increasingly, her thoughts drifted to Tomasz, his face, his voice, the weight of his absence when he was called away on missions. Letters became their secret tether. When Tomasz was stationed at the airfield in Oxfordshire, Eleanor wrote daily, her cramped script recounting the small dramas of city life. The blackout that lasted too long, the neighbour's cat who returned after 3 weeks missing, the taste of oranges sent from home. Sometimes his replies arrived within days, the pages stained with oil or the faint scent of tobacco. Other times, weeks passed with nothing but silence. "Hope is a stubborn thing," he wrote once, and she pressed the letter to her lips, willing herself to believe it. The war's obstacles grew more insistent. News of heavy losses haunted the press office. The names of missing pilots whispered down the corridors like a curse. Eleanor struggled with the ethics of her profession. Her editors pressed her to write about the heroics of the Allied airmen, about Tomasz in particular, with his tragic history and foreign charm. The war needed stories, they insisted. Stories were as necessary as bullets, but she hesitated, torn between the obligation to bear witness and the desire to shield Tomasz from the world's gaze. In unguarded moments, she imagined what it would mean to be known, not as a symbol but as a person, with hopes and fears and a future that might be stolen at any moment. One evening, as autumn surrendered to winter, Eleanor visited Miss Cartwright at the library. The old librarian, herself a relic from another era, poured tea with trembling hands. "You seem troubled, dear," Miss Cartwright observed, peering over the rim of her spectacles. Eleanor hesitated, then confessed, "I'm not sure how much of myself to put into my work, or how much of someone else's story is mine to tell." Miss Cartwright's eyes softened. "During a war, we all borrow a little of each other's courage, but we must never forget that every story belongs to a beating heart." The words lingered with Eleanor as she left, the city's darkness pressing close. She resolved to write, but carefully, to honor Tomasz's trust, to keep the most fragile truths for themselves. Then came the night when everything changed. It was a Thursday, she remembered, because she'd spent the afternoon in the press office, her knuckles aching from cold and worry, her editor barking for copy. The air was thick with rumors, a raid over the Channel, a squadron overdue. Eleanor's hands trembled as she sorted through the teletype reports, her eyes searching for familiar names. No word came, not that day, not the next. Tomasz's letters, which had always arrived like clockwork, suddenly stopped. Days stretched into weeks. Eleanor clung to routine, rising at dawn, filing stories, walking the ruined streets with her notebook in hand. She tried to keep her world small, manageable, but everywhere she went, reminders of Tomasz lurked. In the yellowed pages of his poems, in the battered mug he'd left on her windowsill, in the ache that settled beneath her ribs. She wrote to the airfield, to the Red Cross, to anyone who might know something. The replies, when they came, were infuriatingly polite. "We regret that we are unable to provide information at this time. The ministry offers its condolences. Please be assured that every effort is being made." The silence was a wound that would not heal. Eleanor's friends in the boarding house grew quiet around her. She saw their pity, their fear that hope had become a liability. At night, she dreamed of Tomasz's voice, of the warmth of his hand against her cheek, of words left unspoken. One morning a thin envelope arrived, her own handwriting on the front, marked undeliverable. She pressed it to her chest, choking on the finality. The city outside her window seemed to shrink, the air thick with loss. She returned to the war memorial. It had been unveiled only weeks before, its stones still pale, the names too many to count. Eleanor stood in the drizzle, her gloved finger tracing the letters. Lt. Tomasz Zielinski. She did not cry. She simply stood, the bells tolling, the city holding its breath. That was when the stranger tapped her shoulder, the whisper threading through the rain. "He's alive." The words shattered her numbness, awakening something fierce and wild in her chest. She spun around, but the stranger had already melted into the crowd, a shape, a shadow, no more substantial than hope itself. Uncertainty surged in Eleanor, mingling with anger and a desperate, fragile longing. She had spent so long learning to mourn, to let go. Now, with one whispered sentence, the world had splintered again. She pressed her hand to the stone, feeling the cold promise of Tomasz's name. The war was not over. Not for London, not for her, not for the man who might yet be breathing somewhere beyond the city's ruin. As she turned away from the memorial, Eleanor knew she could not rest. She would search for answers, for truth, for the possibility of hope that refused to die. If you want to discover whether Eleanor's search leads her to Tomasz and what really happened on the night he disappeared, make sure you subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter of this extraordinary story. Sometimes the end of one story is only the beginning of another. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. London's battered rooftops shimmered beneath a relentless fine spray, the city's wounds darkening and glistening with each passing hour. Eleanor Whitaker pressed her forehead to the icy pane of her flat, watching the world dissolve into streaks of grey. The blackout curtains at her shoulders felt like velvet blindfolds, the world outside muffled, uncertain, shifting. She clutched a letter in her hand, not from Tomasz but from the Air Ministry. The envelope was thin, its contents barren. She'd read it so many times that the paper had softened at the creases, the bureaucratic language etched into her mind. Missing in action. No further information available at this time. There was no comfort in those words. Only a void. Her typewriter sat idle on the desk, a silent accusation. Eleanor's press credentials meant she was privy to a constant churn of reports. Squadrons lost, pilots listed as missing, airfields bombed in the dark. In another life, she might have written about these things with the practiced detachment of a professional. But now every casualty report was a knife, every silence on the radio a threat. She had lost the boundary between her subject and her soul. She closed her eyes, summoning the memory of Tomasz's voice. It had always been quiet, edged with a gentle Polish lilt that smoothed the hard consonants of English. She remembered the last time they'd spoken, in the shelter beneath St. Mary le Bow, surrounded by strangers and the constant tremulous cough of distant anti-aircraft guns. He'd pressed her hand and recited a line from some poem she could not name, something about returning home on the wings of longing. She had tried to laugh, accused him of being too sentimental for a pilot. He'd smiled, not quite happy, not quite sad. "If I am not sentimental, Eleanor, what else is left?" he'd whispered, and she'd understood. Now the city was all hollow echo and memory. A knock sounded at her door, abrupt and urgent. Eleanor startled, the letter nearly slipping from her fingers. She tugged the blackout curtain aside, peered through the peephole. On the landing stood Ms. Agnes Cartwright, wrapped in her ancient tartan shawl, clutching a basket of scones as if it were a talisman against the world's cruelties. Eleanor let her in. The old librarian's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, took in Eleanor's unbrushed hair and empty teacup. "You haven't slept," Agnes observed. She set down her basket and busied herself pouring tea, as if the simple rituals of warmth and sustenance could mend what war had torn. "I keep thinking I'll hear from him," Eleanor murmured, staring at her hands. "But the letters, and they've stopped. Even his squadron won't say anything." Agnes sat, her joints creaking. "My brother was listed as missing in the last war. We waited 2 years for news. Sometimes, Eleanor, no news is—" She hesitated, searching for a word that wasn't a lie. "Not always a death sentence," Eleanor offered, half smiling. Agnes pressed her hand, a lifeline in the dark. "You're not alone, dear. Not truly." She paused, her gaze fixed on the trembling tea in her cup. "Have you seen the papers today?" Eleanor shook her head. "There's to be a service out in the village near the airfield. They've finished the new memorial. Your Tomasz. His name is on it." The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She'd known, of course, that this day would come, the day when his absence would become a matter of public record, not just private grief. She thought of the stone, cold and final, and felt a wild, irrational anger. "How can they carve his name in stone when they don't even know?" she whispered. Agnes only squeezed her hand tighter. The train out of Paddington rattled through a countryside still bearing scars of war, fields pockmarked by bomb craters, hedgerows ragged and torn. Eleanor pressed her forehead to the glass, watching rain trace frantic paths down the window, her thoughts circling in ever tighter spirals. She remembered the first time Tomasz had taken her to the airfield. It was nothing like the grand, streamlined runways of home, but a patchwork of muddy tracks and battered hangars, the grass churned to brown soup by the passage of boots and lorries. The men moved quickly, their faces drawn, their laughter forced and brittle. Tomasz had introduced her to his friends in a mixture of Polish and English, his hand resting lightly on her back. She'd seen the fear in his eyes as he watched the sky, waiting for the next scramble, the next mission. He'd written her a poem once in careful block letters, the ink smudged by rain. "I am not a ghost when I fly into the clouds. I am only a man who remembers home." She carried the scrap of paper in her coat pocket, a talisman against despair. The train ground to a halt in the village. The station platform was crowded, locals in threadbare coats, RAF officers in blue-grey uniforms, children clutching paper flags. The new memorial stood in the square, hidden beneath a tarpaulin. Eleanor felt her chest tighten as she joined the gathering throng. The vicar spoke, his words lost in the wind. The cloth fell away, revealing the polished granite, names engraved in neat, unyielding lines. Tomasz Zielinski. She stared at the letters, unable to breathe. A hand touched her shoulder. "Excuse me, miss." She turned. The man was middle-aged, with a face lined by hardship, eyes dark and unreadable beneath a battered cap. His accent was unmistakably Polish. "You are Miss Whitaker, yes?" he asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, her heart hammering. He leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do not believe what they write in stone. He is alive." For a moment, the world tilted. Eleanor stared at him, struggling for words. "Who are you?" she managed. The man glanced around, wary. "I cannot speak here. Please come." They walked quickly through the side streets, Eleanor's shoes slipping on the wet cobbles, her mind racing. The man led her to a tiny, crowded tea shop, its windows fogged, the air heavy with the smell of boiled cabbage and wet wool. He gestured for her to sit in a back booth, shielded from view. "My name is Piotr Wozniak," he said. "I was with Tomasz, your Tomasz, when we escaped Poland. We served together in the Air Force, and after the Germans came, we fled." Eleanor gripped her teacup, hands shaking. "But they say he's dead. His squadron, no one answers my letters. His name is on the memorial." Piotr's gaze was steady, unblinking. "The mission was not what they told you. It was a special flight, over the Channel, deep into France. Only a few knew. They crashed, yes, but not all died. Some were taken." "Taken," she repeated, the word tasting like metal. "Prisoners. The Germans, Gestapo perhaps. There are rumors, nothing certain. But I have a friend, a man who works with the Red Cross. He says a pilot matching Tomasz's description was seen, in a camp, somewhere in France." Eleanor's heart lurched. Hope, wild and reckless, surged through her veins. "Why hasn't anyone told me? Why is his name—" Bureaucracy. Confusion. They list the missing as dead, to spare the families, to tidy the records. But the truth— He shook his head, bitterness sharpening his voice. "The truth is always messier." She pressed her hands to her temples, mind reeling. "But if he's alive, how do I find him? What can I do?" Piotr leaned in, lowering his voice to a thread. "There are people who can help. The Red Cross moves messages. Sometimes they arrange for news to pass, even letters. But you must be careful. We cannot draw attention. If the wrong people suspect—" He trailed off, eyes darting to the window. Eleanor drew a ragged breath. "I'll do anything. Please, you have to help me." He nodded. "I will try. But you must be patient, and you must not tell the authorities yet. The Germans are watching everything, and if they think someone is searching—" She swallowed hard, her mind a whirlpool of fear and longing. "What should I do?" "Write him a letter. Short, nothing that would give away who you are or where. Use the Red Cross address. I will show you. I will take it myself." She nodded, numb. Piotr scribbled an address on a scrap of paper, slid it across the table. "If you hear anything, if there is news, how will I know?" she whispered. "I will find you," he said, rising. "Wait. Hope." He slipped out into the rain, leaving Eleanor alone in the steaming, crowded shop, her heart pounding so loudly she feared others must hear. That night, back in her flat, Eleanor sat at her desk, the blackout lamp casting a lonely circle of light. She stared at a blank sheet of paper, Tomasz's battered poem beside her. The city outside was silent, but for the distant, mournful wail of an air raid siren, its sound rising and falling like a question with no answer. She began to write. "My dearest, they put your name in stone today, but I do not believe in stone. I believe in you wherever you are. If you can, if you are able, send me a sign. I will wait for you as long as it takes." She hesitated, then signed only her initial, E. She folded the letter, tucked it into an envelope, and copied the address Piotr had given her. Her hands trembled as she sealed it, as if the act itself might conjure Tomasz home. She sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the thunder of distant guns, feeling both more alive and more afraid than she had ever been. Days passed, The city ground on, stubborn and battered. Eleanor went to work each morning, composing stories about the war's slow progress, the daily heroism of ordinary people. She watched the headlines: Stalingrad, Normandy, Rome, each a world away from her own private battle. There were no letters, no word from Tomasz, no sign from Piotr. Hope ebbed and flowed, a tide she could not control. She took to walking the city at night, the streets eerily quiet beneath the blackout. Once she passed the war memorial, the stones slick with rain, Tomasz's name gleaming in the lamplight. She pressed her palm to the cold stone, whispered a promise to wait. Agnes watched her with worried eyes, bringing tea and scones, sitting in silence as Eleanor turned the radio dial, searching for a voice that never came. One night, as she returned from the press office, she found a scrap of paper slipped beneath her door. The Red Cross has news. Come to the church at midnight. P. Eleanor's hands shook as she read the note. She checked the corridor empty. She dressed quickly, pulling on her coat and boots, heart racing. The church was dark, its windows aglow with candlelight. She slipped inside, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. Piotr waited in a side chapel, a battered satchel at his feet. He handed her an envelope. It took weeks to come, but it is for you. Her breath caught as she recognized the handwriting. Inside was a single sheet, scrawled in pencil. Tomasz, I'm alive. I think of you every hour. They call this place Stalag Luftethred. There is hope. I will hold it close for you. T. She pressed the letter to her lips, tears spilling down her cheeks, joy and anguish warring inside her. Tomasz was alive. A prisoner, yes, but alive. The war was not over. His name was not written in stone. Not truly. She looked up at Piotr, gratitude overflowing. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded, his eyes shining. Hope is a kind of defiance, he said softly. Eleanor stepped out into the London night, the rain on her face indistinguishable from tears. For the first time in months, the city seemed to breathe again. The bells of St. Paul's tolled in the darkness, and she let the sound fill her, a promise echoing in the storm. I will wait. I will not let go. And somewhere in a distant camp behind enemy lines, Tomasz Zielinski was alive, holding on to hope. For her. A hush lingered in the air long after the memorial ceremony ended, as if the stone itself grieved. Eleanor remained motionless, oblivious to the dispersing crowd. Her mind replayed the stranger's whispered words. He's alive. Over and over, each repetition a tremor that threatened to split her open anew. Her hand trembled as she pressed it against Tomasz's name, cold and final beneath her palm. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure his voice, his laughter, the brush of his fingers at her elbow as they navigated a blackout, the weight of his hand over hers as he recited poetry in the dark. But reality pressed back. The war had taught her the cruelty of hope, how it could buoy you above the floodwaters one day and leave you gasping the next. She had seen so many faces light up with rumor and speculation, only to be extinguished by telegrams edged in black. So many names on these stones that would never be more than names. Yet the stranger's eyes had been earnest, his accent unmistakably Polish, his grip urgent. He's alive. It was not a plea, but a promise. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt something fragile stir, a stubborn, reckless thread of belief. She turned, scanning the thinning crowd for the stranger, but he had disappeared as quickly as he'd come, swallowed by the city's labyrinthine streets. A cold drizzle began anew, pinpricks on her cheeks. She pulled her coat tighter, pressing the envelope in her pocket, closer to her heart. The last returned letter to Tomasz, unopened, marked, missing, believed killed. Eleanor walked through the ruined streets, boots splashing through puddles laced with ash. She passed the newsagent's window, its headlines blaring fresh horrors from Normandy and the Pacific. She passed the bread line, the weary faces pinched but determined. Every face she met seemed to carry a private loss, a secret hope. She wondered what stories they told themselves to make it through the day. Back in her flat, Eleanor stared at her typewriter, blank page gleaming accusingly. She had told so many stories about the war, about sacrifice and resilience and the price of freedom. Yet when it came to her own story, she faltered. She had always believed in the power of truth, in bearing witness, but the truth now felt slippery, treacherous. What was real, the name on the stone or the whisper in her ear? She remembered Tomasz's words scribbled in the margins of his last letter. "If I do not come back, do not let me become only a story. Remember the man, not only the name." A knock at the door startled her. She crossed the tiny room, heart-tripping, and opened it to find Miss Cartwright, her elderly neighbour and sometime confidant, bundled in a mismatched scarf. "My dear, I saw you at the memorial," Miss Cartwright said gently. "You looked as though your soul had been left out in the rain." Eleanor managed a wan smile. "It feels that way." The librarian patted her arm. "Sometimes we must allow ourselves to believe in miracles, even if the world says otherwise. Come, I've made tea. Let me tell you what I've learned from the archives about missing men." Eleanor followed, grateful for the warmth and the distraction. In Ms. Cartwright's book-lined parlour, surrounded by the comforting scent of old paper and bergamot, she listened as the older woman recounted stories, some tragic, some miraculous, of men listed as lost, only to return months later, gaunt but alive. Stories of secret hospitals, mistaken identities, coded messages in letters. "There's always a gap between what is known and what is true," Miss Cartwright said, pouring milk into her cup. "War is a fog. Sometimes we must walk by faith, not sight." Eleanor left the flat that evening with a notebook full of scribbled names and addresses, hospitals and refugee centres, places where the lost had sometimes been found. She spent the next days in a flurry, chasing rumours through phone calls and train rides, braving ration tea and cold railway benches, refusing to let the stone in her chest harden. She visited the Polish community centre in Kensington, where the stranger had been seen before. No one knew his name, but someone remembered a man who helped displaced pilots find their way to safety after missions gone wrong. Another directed her to a hospital in Oxfordshire, where a handful of airmen had been brought in weeks ago, unidentified, injured, their records muddled by chaos. Eleanor's hope grew in increments, a nurse's slight nod, a vague description matching Tomasz's eyes, a poem left on a bedside table, unsigned but unmistakably his. Each thread pulled her forward, even as doubt gnawed at her resolve. One night after her last train back from Oxford, Eleanor sat in her flat, exhaustion pressing her head to the desk. The city outside was silent, the blackout deep as velvet. She remembered the first story Tomasz had ever told her, of flying over the channel, the moonlight like a silver path home. She let herself weep for a long time, for all the stories unfinished, for all the love that war could not erase. Then, with trembling hands, she began to write. Not an article, but a letter. One last letter to Tomasz, not knowing if it would ever reach him, but needing to set the words free. Dearest Tomasz, if you are out there, if you can hear me through the noise and the distance, know that I have not let you become only a name on a stone. You are the man who taught me to see poetry in broken things, who showed me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to love in spite of it. I will keep searching as long as I have breath, and I will not forget. Yours always, Eleanor. She placed the letter in her coat pocket the next morning, unsure what she would do with it, but unwilling to let the hope die. Days passed. London's summer unfolded, green and persistent amid the ruins. The war moved ever forward, headlines shifting, old wounds replaced by new ones. Eleanor returned to her work, reporting from the battered East End, writing stories of survival and reunion, each one a prayer in disguise. And then, one afternoon, as she left her office, she saw the stranger again, standing at the corner, hat pulled low, eyes scanning the street. He looked up and caught her gaze, beckoning her with a tilt of his head. Eleanor's heart pounded as she approached. He spoke softly, in careful English. "You look for Tomasz Zielinski." She nodded, hope and fear warring within her. He handed her a slip of paper, creased and worn. "Go to St. Mary's Hospital, Oxford. Ask for Ward 7. There is someone there who waits." Before she could thank him, he melted into the crowd, leaving her clutching the paper as if it were a lifeline. The journey to Oxford was surreal, fields flashing past the window, the sky vast and tremulous. Eleanor rehearsed every possibility, a mistake, a cruel joke, a ghost of hope. She forced herself to breathe steady and slow. At the hospital, the corridors smelled of antiseptic and lavender. Nurses moved quietly, their faces lined with exhaustion and kindness. She found Ward 7, her footsteps echoing. She stopped at the threshold, afraid to look, afraid not to. There, by the window, bandaged and thinner than she remembered, sat Tomasz. His eyes were closed, face turned toward the pale afternoon sun. For a moment, Eleanor could not move. She drank in the sight of him, alive, impossibly, gloriously alive. She stepped forward, breath catching. "Tomasz?" His eyes opened slowly, disoriented, then focused. A smile, hesitant and wondrous, curved his lips. "Eleanor?" She rushed to his side, words tumbling over one another. How? When? Why? He took her hand, weak but warm, and she felt the world right itself. He spoke quietly, explaining how his plane had gone down behind enemy lines, how he'd been hidden by villagers, smuggled across France by the resistance, wounded but determined to return. Months lost in a haze of pain and hope. "I thought only of you," he whispered, voice rough. "It was your memory that kept me alive." Eleanor wept then, not from grief, but from the unbearable relief of hope fulfilled. She held his hand, tracing the lines of his fingers, real and warm and alive. Days blurred into one another as Tomasz recovered. Eleanor visited daily, reading to him from books and letters, sharing stories of London, of the world he'd left behind. They spoke of the war, of loss, of what it meant to go on loving when the world itself seemed broken. Tomasz, once haunted by survivors' guilt, began to write again, poems for Eleanor, for his fallen friends, for the city that had become his home. He spoke of returning to Poland one day, of rebuilding, but for now he chose hope over regret. Eleanor, changed by her search, found a new resolve. She returned to her work with a deeper understanding, not only reporting the facts, but seeking the quiet truths hidden in the margins. She wrote of reunions and miracles, of ordinary people choosing love over despair. Her writing, once precise and distant, now pulsed with empathy and courage. Their love, tested by war, became a quiet anchor. In a world of uncertainty, they found solace in small things. A shared cup of tea, a walk through the hospital gardens, the simple act of being present. They allowed themselves to dream cautiously of a future beyond the war, a future shaped not by fear, but by the stubborn resilience of hope. As the war ground on and victory finally came into view, Eleanor and Tomasz stood together at the edge of London, watching fireworks burst above the scarred city. The past lingered, full of names and memories, but they faced it hand in hand. Eleanor no longer feared the stone of the memorial, for she understood that names carved in granite could never contain the fullness of a life, or the echo of love that survived even the darkest nights. She would remember Tomasz not as a name on a wall, but as the man who chose to live, to hope, to love, despite it all. And as she told their story, her story to the world, she remembered the stranger's words and passed them on. He's alive. Not only in flesh, but in memory, in hope, in every act of courage that lit the darkness. So, as you listen now, I ask you, what names would you remember? What hopes would you hold on to, even when the world insists they are lost? Share your own stories in the comments below, stories of hope, of love that endured, of miracles both great and small. If this tale moved you, give it a like, and subscribe for more stories that remind us all. Even in the shadow of war, hope finds a way. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment where the impossible becomes possible. Thank you for listening, for remembering, for believing, and wherever you are, may you carry hope with you, stubborn and shining, through every storm.